Have you ever noticed how some people seem obsessed with looking humble? And I mean looking, not being. It's a curious contradiction, isn't it? Why do we feel that we need to shrink ourselves? That's even the right word here. Just to appear modest. Is humility really about diminishing who we are to please others? Or is it something deeper? Hi, welcome to Sometimes Curious, Often Confused. I'm Richard Okonwo. Mathematics is my study, but people are my passion. I'm not a pro, just someone who believes nobody has it all figured out. So, let's dive into the questions that make us curious and see where they take us. Humility, as defined by the Oxford English Dictionary, is the quality of having a modest or low view of one's importance. Wiktionary describes it as a disposition to be humble, a lack of false pride. And that's the general idea we have about humility, right? This idea that this person is not exaggerating their sense of being. They are not trying to appear more than what they are. It's the opposite of pride. And pride is one of the 7 deadly sins, which means that humility is the opposite, a virtue, something that should be encouraged, something that we should clap for. The problem now is that when humility becomes an obligation, it loses its genuineness. Instead of personal values, it turns into social currency, something people feel compelled to display, not because it's who they are, but because it's what others expect. A few years ago, I met this guy. For reasons I couldn't fully understand, always prostrated and called me sir. At first, too, I thought it was respect, but over time, it started to feel unnatural. It wasn't just the repeated acts of deference, it was about how exaggerated they felt. It was like he was performing humility rather than living it. And the more it happened, the less genuine it seemed. And that's the tricky thing about humility. When it feels forced, it loses its essence. It's almost like watching someone follow a script rather than just being themselves. Now, I would like to discuss how to be able to distinguish genuine and forced humility. Not like I have it figured out, of course, I'm not a pro. This is just based on my own experience, and I will still want to know how you are able to distinguish. I'm still going to ask for that later. But how do we tell them apart? How do we differentiate when someone is being genuinely humble versus when someone is performing it without knowing their other traits? Now, first, without knowing their other traits, it can be a bit tricky because we just met this person and it's very difficult to tell what they are like around other people. We just met them, right? But one of the things about genuine humility is that it passes the test of time. So how do we distinguish genuine versus false humility? The first one I would like to talk about is how we differentiate it without knowing their other traits. I would say looking for consistencies, at least in my own experience. Consistency in behavior across different situations and people can really be very, very helpful. For instance, how do they treat people that they are likely never to see again? Get ready. First of all, I want to talk about how to be able to distinguish it when we don't know their other traits. Like, we don't know them, we don't know how they behave, we just met them newly. First of all, I pay attention to how exaggerated it seems to me. There are people that are natural hype men, they hype people. But when it feels exaggerated to me and totally unnecessary, like totally unnecessary in uppercase letters, that is my first clue that this is fake. This is being forced. The second one is that people that force humility, from what I've seen, they emphasize too much on humility. They point to it too much, a little too much. Generally, every one of us encourages humility as a society. We encourage it. People should be humble. Yes, because it brings this idea of inclusion. It makes everybody to belong. It gives us this idea that no matter who you are, no matter what you have accomplished, at the end of the day, we are still all human beings. But these people tend to do it a little too much. And there's always this virtue signaling. If it was me, I will be humble. I will humble myself. If it was me, I didn't ask you what you were going to do if it was you.
Of course, every one of us, we virtue signal every once in a while, right? But this particular topic is around the topic of humility. Don't worry, I'm going to address your own virtue signal in the future episode. Maybe not the next one, but definitely I am going to touch your own virtue signaling. That one that you have, yes, I'm going to touch it. And for those that don't know what virtue signaling is, it's this act, at least from the way I understand it, virtue signaling is you try to put up this act and try to show that, hey, look at me, I am this kind of person, oh, I'm this kind of person, oh, I'm different from every other person. I'm not like just every other person. And from this topic of humility, what these people tend to do is that they always put themselves in that scene, even when nobody asks them to put themselves in that scene. If it was me, I would have handled it differently. I wouldn't have been so proud. I would have just humbled myself. As if people humbling themselves is something that people just wake up and just say, today I'm going to be humble. For today, I'm going to humble myself. I'm going to put myself down. Another one is that first humility, it also involves grand gestures that are performative and insincere. We all know that person, right? That person that if you hear from people close to them, they will tell you that this person is not a good person, that they are not genuinely nice, that they are not so kind as they make people to believe that they are. Both in how they help people financially, how they help people morally, they tend to offer too much moral support to people that don't even need it. They offer it, but there are people that are very, very close to them who they treat like shit. We all know someone like this, right? Someone who people close to them are screaming and shouting that this person is not treating them right, that this person is not a good person, that this person is not as good as they pretend to be. But from the way we see this particular person that they are describing, they are cheerful, they are jovial, they are kind, they are nice to people around them, especially acquaintances. It makes me wonder, sometimes people doubt the ones close to these individuals. Whenever you meet someone and people that have been with them for a long period of time tells you that this person is not as humble as they perform, that this person is not as nice as they portray themselves to be, please pay attention. Because most of the time, these people that put up these performances, it's going to wear out over time. Sometimes these are performative acts of kindness that they use to buy people over, to make them feel like they are together or they belong to the same league. It's going to wear off over time, certainly. Which brings us to the second part, which is what happens over time and how can you be able to tell apart people that are genuinely humble from people that are not genuinely humble over time. And the tip that I have here is that over time, genuine humility reveals itself through actions, especially if there is nothing to gain. If over time they don't have anything to gain, you're not an authoritative figure, you don't have any power over them, and still they are persistently humble, I think they are genuine. There's this podcast that I listened to sometime this year. The name of the podcast is Classy. It was a short seasoned podcast. I think it had like 6 episodes or so. It was about the middle class, the upper class, and the lower class. I think this idea of humility, the reason why we encourage it is because it makes people to feel like they belong. Hear me out. It makes people to feel like they belong. There is the upper class, there is the middle class, and there is the lower class. In almost every country, in almost every society, there is always these 3 categories. Now, humility tends to be a leveler. When someone who is in the upper class pretends not to be in the upper class for a while, you might call it putting up an act. But when they pretend to be not the upper class, but maybe the middle class, or maybe not rich, people don't outrightly tell you the class that they belong to. We are the ones that do the categorization by ourselves, right? Now, when someone pushes themselves down to a lower class, it makes them to belong. It makes them not to seem arrogant, to seem like they're just like every other person. They don't want to be left out. And there are these pre-assumptions that we have for people that have some certain characteristics already. For people that are rich, there is this general picture that people that are rich are arrogant and they don't care about any other person. They just keep stepping on people. But putting on this out of humility can make them seem like they belong, even though we know they are not like us. They are not like the general population. They are high up there in the class. Now, there was this podcast I listened to earlier this year. The name of the podcast is Classy. It was a short seasoned podcast. I think it was like between 6 to 8 episodes. And one of the things that I picked up from that podcast is the idea that people that are in the high class, they don't always want to identify as being in the upper class because just as Ashake said, it's lonely at the top. They don't want to be left out. But when they shrink themselves a little, at least to the middle class, it makes them appear as though they are like the regular person. And at least for a while, the middle class doesn't seem to have much of an issue. That was another thing that I picked up from that podcast. To wrap up this episode, I would like to say there's a fine line between being humble and putting on a show. And once you see it, it's very, very hard to unsee. And humility that comes naturally, it feels effortless. But when it is forced, it feels heavy, like wearing someone else's shoe, like trying to put up an act and trying to behave like someone else. Alright, I want to hear about your own experience. Yes, your own experience, you. Have you ever met someone that didn't seem genuinely humble, that seemed like they were putting up a performance the whole time that you knew them? I would like to hear from you. How did it turn out over time and how were you able to handle it? Do you know of any celebrity that seems to be putting up this performance of humility from your instincts that this person is just trying to fake it? Do you think forced humility is better than outright arrogance? Then the fourth one. Do you think humility is something that must be learned over time? The idea of continuous practice. Or do you think it's something that people can just adopt overnight? Alright, here is the fifth one. Have you ever forced humility? Have you ever tried to put up a performance? You want to look humble. Okay, I'm going to make an excuse on your behalf. Maybe it was because someone complimented your humility and you just couldn't help it. Maybe it was not even intentional, but you were humble for that moment. And then when someone complimented you, you couldn't help it. You told yourself you needed to keep putting up this performance that you are humble so that you can fit in. Send your feedbacks to scocpod@outlook.com. The address is in the description. Also, do well to follow the show and myself. The links are in the description. Thank you so much for listening to this episode, and until next week, stay curious.